Hi there. So I'm Casey Fiesler. I am an assistant professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I am here to introduce you to our tutorial. Welcome to the teacher side of FACT 2021. Also the ethics side of FACT 2021, except that's probably a bigger side. Okay, so you might have noticed that in recent years, we've seen a lot of tech ethics controversies, a lot of them, in fact, that have a lot to do with the things that folks at FACT care about. Because, I gotta say, these ethics controversies tend to really hit data science and AI a lot harder than some other subfields of computer science. Like, where are all of the operating systems and theory ethical controversies? I don't know. But one of the side effects of increasing public attention to these issues, poll an average person on the street, and it's very likely that they know that AI bias is a thing and have heard of Cambridge Analytica. And one of the things that we hear in the media and in public commentary is, wow, someone should be teaching those computer science students ethics. Now, of course, we know that many computer science students are learning ethics. And to make a point, I crowdsourced a giant spreadsheet of tech ethics syllabi a few years ago, which, by the way, if you're in this tutorial, you probably want to look at it or even add your own class to it. But we're definitely seeing calls for more and more specific types of ethics, too, right? For example, there's a new class this semester in my department, co-taught by Robin Burke, on fairness in AI. And in fact, in this tech ethics spreadsheet, the most common specific standalone class is an AI ethics class. I also just got an email from someone in our philosophy department who wants to teach an AI ethics class. So really, it's a lot of the people at FACT who might be called upon to teach these things. And not all of you are already teaching this kind of content, right? Like, even if it's part of your research, it might not be a class that you're teaching, or maybe you teach a machine learning class or an AI class or an NLP class. You should probably have ethics in those too. My hope is that some of the people who are at this tutorial are as much or more experts than the people who are organizing it. We put together this tutorial both as a way for us to share our experiences and maybe some suggestions and best practices, but also for people to come together to share. I definitely know that I have a lot to learn and am constantly getting ideas from other people. You are going to be hearing from all of our organizers at some point. But in addition to me, we have Solon Barakis at Microsoft Research and Cornell, Augustin Chintreau from Columbia, Jesse Smith, also from University of Colorado Boulder, and Michael Zimmer at Marquette. We all have our own different kinds of experiences with teaching ethics of various flavors in various ways. I also do some research about CS ethics education in general. And also, Augustine and I are both part of the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, which is dedicated to thinking about integrating ethics into technical computing classes, which is something that all of us are in favor of. I also think we've been hearing a lot more about this. So my hope is that some of you teach technical classes and are interested in doing integration of ethics in addition to some people who might teach standalone classes. And one of the barriers to doing that integration is I don't know enough about this to teach it, or I don't know what to teach. And so we're hoping this might give people ideas. So the format of this tutorial is that we're going to have some short presentations about some specific things, like strategies for convincing students and other faculty that ethics is even important or relevant to computer science or data science. We'll also talk more about, as I said, integrating ethics throughout the curriculum with a special attention to data science and AI. We'll also talk about building ethics into technical assignments as one particular strategy, and also different types of engaging ethics related content. Like my personal favorite has to do with Black Mirror. After these presentations, we're going to take some time to, depending on how many of you are out there, because I have no idea when I'm filming this, talk as a group or break into smaller groups in order to brainstorm challenges and topics of concern. What kind of puzzles are we unraveling? What are the limitations? And then we will have a panel discussion with the organizers to address some of these things as best we can, as well as to get input from everyone else who has joined us. And also, hopefully, some action items and maybe a plan for shared future action. But in any case, I hope that you get something out of this tutorial. And I hope it also gives you something that you can share with others, whether it's other faculty back in your department who are also thinking about these things, or who you want to think about these things, or with your students. So that's what you get from me for the short intro, and I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more from me.
Hello, everyone. You are immediately hearing more from me. Hi, I'm Casey, and you just saw my YouTube skills, which I'm currently cultivating. First of all, I want to say that, the format for this is not ideal. My hope is that we can continue to have these conversations at future facts when we can, be in a room looking at each other and talking to each other. And this was particularly important for us because we, as we were putting together this tutorial, it was really less about let us tell you all the things we know and more about let's learn from each other. And I'm really hoping that there are some folks who are watching this and interacting right now who can teach us a lot of things as well. We don't represent a particularly diverse group here in terms of types of people and types of educators. And I'm really hoping that there's going to be a lot of interaction, which sounds a bit ironic for me to say since you're just, watching a live stream right now. So in addition to the Slido, which I assume that all of you can see right now, and I saw that we already had a question, which is awesome. We would like to facilitate interaction via a shared Google Doc that we've set up. I think someone has, or if not, will shortly put the link in the Slido so that you can see it, but it is bit.ly/ where did we go? Ethics-crash course. If you go to that document, anyone who is watching this, we've basically set up kind of a virtual whiteboard and a means of communication and interaction for the next 90 minutes. One of the things that you'll see first, for example, is a place for you to introduce yourselves if you would like. The organizers have already done that. You can include any information about yourself that you would like. And this document will remain there after all of this is done in case you meet someone in that document that then you want to connect with later. We've also added a spot for people to share resources that they are familiar with. And we'll have, after some short presentations from us to give you some ideas to get going, we also have a place with some provocations for you to think about your answers to some questions, and then also places for you to ask questions of us. Since we're not able to do, discussions as we would have liked, we're gonna do these short presentations, have a little bit of a break to think a bit, and then we're gonna do a kind of panel discussion, but we really want to bring in all of your ideas as well. Feel free to ask questions either in the document or on Slido if you have questions about kind of the format of what's going on, but that is basically my introduction. And so as I said in the video, there are some things that we wanted to touch on in order to give you some ideas. And so each of us are going to do a short presentation about some things that we are familiar with, starting with Solon.
Thanks, Casey. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Okay. Hopefully people can see. I'm assuming that's the case. Great. Hi, everyone. So I'm Solon Brokus. I'm a researcher at Microsoft Research and faculty at Cornell. I'm also looking at multiple screens at the same time to keep track of everything, and it's very exciting to see everyone entering their introductions. It's nice to know that there's folks out there, even if we can't see you. I thought what we could do to start off with some of the substance of the discussion today is kind of tackle this very fundamental question, which is, when people talk about teaching ethics classes in computer science, data science, or these adjacent fields, what is that class? What is like an ethics education in this field actually entail? And like many of the other folks who I have the privilege of co-organizing this tutorial with, I've also been kind of exploring what other people have been doing when they start teaching these classes. And it's clear that these classes actually, really span the range of possible approaches to trying to educate students about these topics. And what I'll do as a starting point is just kind of give an overview of what to me stand out as some distinct ways of approaching this type of work, trying to highlight some interesting differences, but not with the goal of suggesting that any one is the best way, but instead to just kind of give you a sense of the diversity of approaches and what you might get by choosing one or another, or how you might think about integrating them. So my slides are very straightforward. They're really just here to kind of keep us going. So one way that I think people have approached teaching ethics in this domain, and this I think has the kind of longest history, is to think about this in terms of professional responsibility. So in fact, if you come from an engineering department, there might actually even be requirements to teach professional responsibility classes. So ABET is a kind of an accreditation for some departments. And that accreditation actually requires that they teach classes in professional responsibility. And here, this orientation tends to take the form of thinking about, if I were to train, for example, a structural engineer, what ethical obligations might they have? And so that might include things like the building doesn't fall down, and that they don't mislead their clients, and that they have some degree of integrity in dealing with people who have hired them to build these structures. And when these same concerns are sort of ported over to computer science, they tend to take a similar flavor, right? So this is about kind of honest dealing with your clients, being kind of upfront and a kind of good faith broker, making sure that the stuff that you produce kind of meets some basic standards of security, et cetera. And this certainly, I think, encompasses what we might think of as ethical issues, and approaching it in this way, I think, can really help people understand that in general, these are sort of privileged positions to be in, and there are certain expectations about minimum standards that you might want to meet. But this is only one of many other ways. And so another way of thinking about this might be to teach a class like this in terms of research ethics. And actually, especially for our graduate students, we might think of it as the kind of preferred approach to teaching these classes. So for example, increasingly computer science research, data science research involves people. And to the extent that these are human subjects, these are research projects that involve human subjects, research ethics directly apply. So what are the ethical obligations as researchers or future researchers that students need to be aware of? Basic things around the IRB and kind of the principles from the Belmont report. And here, even some of these ideas have begun to kind of port over to some of the major conferences in computer science, like, for example, NeurIPS and ICML, where there are increasingly discussions around research ethics and other things, which we'll get to in a moment. But this is a very particular orientation, thinking about what is at stake in the research, not necessarily what's at stake in people who go on to become practitioners. I think in part because of a conference like FACT, another way of approaching teaching has been to turn ethical and normative questions into technical research problems, right? So this actually is very obvious, I think, in the recent turn, where fairness concerns have become largely the domain of computer scientists. But this is even true for things like privacy, right? So privacy is taught, in many, many computer science departments, but it's largely taught as a technical problem. And so one way that people begun to approach these issues is to transform what have felt maybe like amorphous normative questions into these more, kind of rigorous technical questions. And of course, this has trade-offs, right? It makes it potentially more accessible for people who have a much more technical orientation, but perhaps you trade it off against other ways of thinking about these issues. A different approach, and one I think that maybe many of us take, many of us in the kind of co-organizers of the tutorial, is also to kind of help people understand the relevant law and policy that would apply to the area of computer science where people potentially work, right? So this can range from things that, like, for example, I'm familiar with, which is like how discrimination law might apply to the use of machine learning. But of course, to the extent that computing is everywhere, right, we can think of this as also implicating all sorts of law, right? So when we think about platforms, and we can think about liability and content moderation and all these kind of questions. And so here, you might think of that this as being not training people to become future lawyers or policymakers, but instead to help them understand the relevant law and policy that should structure the work they're doing, which you can think of as being maybe somewhat in contrast to a more kind of hands-on training with dealing with like the practicalities of complying with the law. And here what I'm thinking of is like, let's not just teach people the relevant kind of high-level legal principles, but let's actually show them how to comply with the law at a much lower, more granular level, right? So this can be things like, what are the specific standards you have to follow? What tools are available to help you comply, et cetera. And this might even eventually become things like, what are the set of kind of fairness mitigations that you want to apply? And here's how you might use them. And in this case, it wouldn't be a research question, it would be more, how do you actually apply the tools that other people have developed? And I think there's a kind of direction I see education heading in this direction. And then the final thing, and this is not to say that this list is exhaustive, but the final thing is to kind of have a much broader view, right? Where the goal is not to sort of treat these issues as a matter of individual responsibility, where the understanding is that if we do a good job sort of educating people and a bunch of these concerns, that they would somehow take on that responsibility themselves. And here, I think the last approach is to kind of take a much more structural view, right? How does computing interact with larger social, political, and historical dynamics, such that we can begin to understand questions of power, questions of justice. And this, I think, involves then literature from a much broader set of fields, including sociology, philosophy, et cetera. And so, again, this is not exhaustive. There's many other approaches, but what has struck me about kind of learning about the way people approach this is that, these really do entail quite different material and quite different approach. And as we talk today, I think it could be helpful to reflect on where you situate yourself with respect to these different options and what you think you might gain by perhaps, venturing into others. So I'll stop there for now. And I think next on the list is Michael. So I will hand off to Michael.
Thanks, Dolan. That's actually a great buildup for what I wanted to talk about for my opening remarks today. Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Zimmer. I'm in the Department of Computer Science at Marquette University. And I guess my little secret, and one of the reasons why I think I'm here, is that I'm not actually a computer scientist. Marquette, a couple of years ago, decided to build an independent computer science program. It's previously merged within another department, and also really build out their data science curriculum and course offerings. And the faculty there realized that, especially given the Jesuit mission at Marquette to focus on things like ethics and justice, that they needed to have someone within the department to really help these students in the CS and data science programs really engage with ethics, more than just checking a box for that ABET accreditation, but really recognizing the importance of having a broad social and ethical training when you're going to go out and build these kinds of tools and platforms. So they brought in someone like me without computer science training, but someone who studies ethics and technology to come in and build courses and teach these students. And I think the one thing that I really wanted to focus on in the opening today was the fact that we needed to have this kind of multidisciplinary approach. I think there's a value by having someone with a background similar to what mine might look like, to come in and engage with these students in a very multidisciplinary kind of way. And sort of, building on what Solon was saying. So we're not just approaching ethics as a technical problem that therefore has a technical solution, but recognizing that it is a rich socio-technical space that we're working in within CS and data science and AI research. And that it's going to require this kind of a multidisciplinary, multi-directional way of thinking about these ethical challenges. So I found it very helpful when I build my courses to be able to speak across disciplines. Our data ethics class that I teach is required in a number of different data analytics programs across our campus. So this includes computer science and data science, but also health analytics, criminal justice and data analytics, some programs in our business school and our nursing programs. And that really gives me the opportunity to build a course that leverages the fact that I have more than just computer science or data science students in the classroom, that I'm able to pull in these different domains, these different levels of technical expertise and literacies, and also different sets of values, similar to again, how Salam was sort of framing this in one of our first questions, that there might be some competing values at play when we're talking about what is the right ethical frame or ethical solution for a problem. And I think if you're able to have a classroom with a rich environment, that really helps benefit the way that you can teach and talk through some of these ethical issues. One other thing that I found quite successful, and I'm not sure if everyone could do this, it would be great, is getting these kinds of courses, whether it's data ethics or ethics in computing or whatever it might be, built into actually your campus's core curriculum. And I've been lucky that in both of the institutions that I've taught at, the class that I taught on technology or data ethics were part of a core curriculum where students could get credit for their general education requirements. So people are coming from all different kinds of majors and taking this class to get a humanities credit or whatever it might be within your university. And again, that allows us to have this really rich mix of students and perspectives within that room where we're talking about these thorny ethical issues. And even if our goal is to primarily train our computer science or data science students, having them sit in a room with students from the humanities and students from the social sciences and students from any other program on campus, again, just gives us a more rich experience to be able to sort of play around with these ideas and think about these issues. Again, getting our thinking outside of the technical space and into this broader socio-technical space. The way I tend to build my classes is often around this discussion of what Bob Kitchen calls the empiricist epistemology. And I have a link in the Google Doc to one of his papers about that. I tend to start by talking about, here's what we're trying to achieve in computer science or data analytics or data science. Here are the tools, here are the technologies, here are the contexts in which we think data and computational approaches are going to help us do things better, do things more efficiently, solve problems that were previously unapproachable. And it's a very empiricist way of thinking about the world. It's a data-driven way of thinking about how to solve some of society's problems. That, of course, is what motivates a lot of what we do and a lot of what our students are trying to do. But then I kind of break that down. We build this up and we point out that, well, guess what, folks? There are limitations. And it's not just computational limitations. There's limitations in how we get our data and where our data is coming from, what we're doing with that data, and then how we apply and deploy these kinds of systems. So it turns into a critique of this empiricist way of thinking about the world. And that connects directly into some of the ethical dilemmas that we're facing. And I found it to be a really helpful way to sort of think through that we're not just throwing ethical problems and ethical dilemmas at our students, but we're helping them see, here's the sort of computer science, data science way of thinking about the world. And now there's some limitations that have ethical implications. And I could share more if we want in terms of how I structure my particular syllabus to try to get us to do that. But I think one of the really important things about what I try to do within my courses, and one of the benefits of the institutions that I've worked at, is also ensuring that I'm not just have diversity in terms of the types of disciplines in the classroom, but really focusing on having a diversity of the voices of what I'm teaching, of what my students are exposed to. And I've tried very hard to make sure that my syllabus and my readings, the videos that I show are of a diverse set of voices that represent both data scientists or computer scientists, and also those who might be engaged in critiques and those who might be impacted by these kinds of systems. And I added a few links to part of the Google Doc where I share a few of the examples of readings and TED Talks that I use where I'm exposing my students to people other than people that look or are identify as I do, because that's the way that we're actually going to engage with ethics. I think when we're dealing with ethics within data science, computer science, so much of it is about recognizing the other and recognizing other kinds of impacts and other kinds of problems of equity. And by having a rich, diverse, set of content, I think is actually quite critical. And I've had multiple semesters where about halfway through, I have a student that reaches out to me because she suddenly realizes that every TED Talk that I've put up has been a woman or a person of color. And it suddenly dawned on her that this is a large universe and we need to make sure that we're exposing our students to these different perspectives and different sets of skills and sets of impacts that people might have. So I think I'll wrap up with this, and we can come back to some of these themes. I think teaching tech ethics from my perspective fits exactly what Solon was saying, that it's more than just technical solutions, that ethics is not a problem that's solvable just by code, but it requires a holistic approach, a multidisciplinary approach, and a diverse approach. And if we can make steps to achieve that, even just with today's workshop, I think we'll make some good steps forward. Next on our list, I think, Casey, is it back to you?
Yes, it is back to me. I have to say, teed up from Michael, I have to make the snarky observation that given everything you just said about how easy it is to find ethics content from women and people of color, how it's a little unfortunate that a lot of people are now learning about tech ethics for the first time from the documentary, The Social Dilemma. Which does
Indeed.
not do that. All right. So I am going to talk about a specific teaching exercise that I use, but as this particular one, in terms of thinking about two specific things. One is, how do you get people to care? And two is what's something that's sort of engaging and fun for students to do. So I'm sharing my screen, and this is a slide deck that you can all go see and play around with and make copies of immediately if you would like. I just put the URL on it, which normally if you're at the slide deck, you would not need. So I do this teaching exercise called the Black Mirror Writers Room, and it was inspired in part by how many students really wanted to talk about Black Mirror in a tech ethics class, like constantly. Dr. Fiesler, have you seen this episode of Black Mirror that relates to what you're talking about? Also, sorry, I'm something with my screen sharing here. Okay. Also, this helps to tee up conversations about current events, which actually would be my other piece of advice for the sort of like, how do you get people to care thing? So, I hear from a lot of people in terms of like, I teach this kind of technical class, like I don't really see how ethics is relevant, et cetera. Or, really any kind of computer science class, but you can't go a day without something related to technology ethics in the news, like a day. You can't go a week without AI bias. There's usually, so like everyone knows about Cambridge Analytica. I mean, it's relevant. Students want to talk about these things. So this is, and again, this is the URL for the slide deck. It's also in that document. I set this up for people to use while they're teaching, which is why there's this sort of like introductory information. But the way that I do this is to tie current events or recent-ish events, not that Google Glass is particularly current, to episodes of Black Mirror. Which, if you're not familiar with it, is a anthology style television show, kind of like Twilight Zone. And it tends to take something that is some current anxiety about technology and push it just a little bit further until it's horrifying. And a lot of students are familiar with this one in particular, which is a sort of like dystopian social media, social credit score kind of thing. I found that this is still, the students are still interested in hearing about this, even if they haven't seen these episodes. And I'm not, these slides are here for when people are teaching it, if it's useful, which is why I'm just kind of going through them. But the way that this works is that groups of students are asked to plot their own episodes of Black Mirror. And one of the reasons that this works quite well for a lot of different kinds of classes is because, you know, you can pick the relevant technology for the class. I have run this exercise as a guest lecturer in information visualization classes, data science, intro programming. I, of course, use it in my ethics class. I've done it with high school students. You can tailor it in terms of the topics that they're focusing on in thinking about the possible future harms of technology. And one of the reasons that I think that this is, sorry, another screen thing. One of the reasons that I think this is so engaging for students is that, like, it's kind of fun to talk about the ethical implications of iRobot or whatever, right? And I always figure that if you can have an in-depth conversation about the ethical implications of some technology that someone might create in 100 years, you should be able to do the exact same thing with what you are creating tomorrow. So I've been thinking about, in some of my research recently, ways to scaffold creative speculation towards thinking about ethics as a skill in the classroom. And this slide deck, so this is not an image, this is a template. And so this is what I provide for students to, because it's also fun to have an artifact. I was trained in constructionism for learning science, and so I always think it's fun to create artifacts as part of this. And these are actually examples of things that students have done when I've run this exercise that you can see in the slide deck. But one of the important things about this, oh wait, where did that slide go? Is that in addition to doing this sort of fun thing and thinking about the possible futures of technology, is then to think about how we don't get there, right? So that's the important conversation to have at the end, is like, okay, so you just described this scenario in which self-driving cars are making these moral decisions, and you talked about how they were problematic. Okay, so what needs to happen? Is this something where we need to be thinking about how autonomous vehicles are designed? Should we be thinking about regulation? Should we be thinking about social norms? Like, what kinds of things, which spurs a lot of interesting conversations. So if you're interested in trying this out for yourself, there's some additional kinds of context here. I've also written about this in a recent law review essay that I linked to in the resources under the link to this. And then I'll also add briefly, because I linked to it there, another thing that you can do in the classroom in terms of this, tying things to current events, et cetera, is to have students bring you current events. I do this in my ethics class, but I think it can work in any computing class, would be having a pass-fail assignment where you have students give you a news article every once in a while that relates to technology in the news or technology ethics in the news. I keep all of these on a public spreadsheet in case they're useful for other people. And by the end of the semester, I have 300 or 400 news articles about tech ethics and policy, which is not hard to get, because again, they're constant, right? They're everywhere. It's actually very rare that students overlap in the things that they give me. So this is just one example of this kind of thing. And I hope that it might be useful for some of you, this particular exercise, or to give you some ideas. And now I will hand it over to Jess.
Thanks, Casey. So just a side note for everyone also, if you are putting your questions into the Q&A, we're not ignoring them. We're going to try to answer some of them while the session is going. And then also after the break, we're going to have a longer panel where we select some of the questions to just brainstorm and talk about further with each other. So we're actually putting the questions into the end of the Google Doc. And if you want, you're welcome to put your questions just directly in there also, but we're keeping track, so we're not ignoring them. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can everyone see that okay? I want to make sure it's showing the right thing. Great. So I'm Jess, and I'm going to be talking about building ethics into introductory coding assignments. So I'm also a PhD student from the University of Colorado Boulder. Casey Fiesler is one of my advisors. And a little bit about my story. I'm a computer scientist by training. I took a computer science ethics class several years ago, and I say I never looked back because that became my career. And last summer, I taught an intro coding class where I restructured the curriculum into 5 ethics-based modules. There's a bit.ly that I've shared in the Google Doc that we're all sharing where you can explore some of those if you'd like. But today I'm going to talk about one of those modules that I created. And before I begin, just a little bit of motivation for why I do this. A lot of the content that I've made for this course and content that I've taught in other classes was inspired by my own experience as an undergrad computer science student. I rarely felt connected or engaged with the coding problems that I was asked to do. And that made it a lot harder for me to learn and retain the content that I was learning in my classes. So that's why for each of the modules that I designed for the summer course that I taught, they were all made to try to expand ethical thinking and ethical decision-making in the classroom, but they were built on the basis that in order for students to engage with course content, the course content needs to engage the students. So it's a two-way street. So today I'm going to talk about one of the case studies, which is one of the modules that I made, and it's all about self-driving cars, and it's about the trolley problem and ethical decision-making. So I'm going to kind of outline just what that assignment was, some of the pedagogy that I implemented, and then some of the benefits that I saw to this approach. So to start off, just to let all of you know, in case you're wondering, this is probably something we'll talk about more extensively. This is something that you can do with any tech or any coding assignment, is incorporate ethics into it. You do not have to entirely restructure your curriculum in order to incorporate ethics into your computer science classroom. It's usually actually a pretty easy switch just to change or reframe the question that you're asking or to reframe the variables that you're asking them to code. It could be as simple as that. So this is actually a really good segue from Casey's talk, because a lot of really easy ways to implement ethics into your coding assignments is to just start by finding current events like tech scandals and new technologies that are relevant to your students, and then to go from there. So in this specific assignment that I made in the self-driving car module, I basically asked the students to pretend like they were on their first day at the job at a company that makes self-driving cars called Mesla. This was because I was trying to make the students feel like they were, it was close to home for them, and it helped them envision what it might be like to actually be in a position at a real job. And it also helped them understand that the decisions they're making in this assignment are real decisions that real people actually do have to make every day. And it's not just some future that they're envisioning that doesn't actually exist. This is things that they're encountering on a daily basis. And so the purpose of the assignment was to have them create and design an algorithm that determined how a self-driving car should make a decision in the event of an unavoidable collision. So basically coding the trolley problem for self-driving cars. And for each coding assignment that I designed for a specific module, I tried to nail down specifically which ethics topics and content I wanted the students to dive deeper into. So for this assignment, since we were exploring the trolley problem, we were focusing largely on ethical decision-making and how we could design algorithms to take ethical trade-offs into account. And something that I want to emphasize here to everybody is that as a teacher, I was not prescriptive ethically. So I never told them that they were making the right or the wrong ethical decision, because I'm not an ethical decision-making master. I don't know if anyone is. And so what I did instead was just facilitate activities that allowed the students to understand the difficulty of ethical decision-making and how they might encounter that someday at their job, as opposed to telling them, this is what you do if you're ethical. This is what you don't do if you're ethical, because that's, there's a lot of issues with that, which maybe we'll discuss a little bit later. So another point here that I want to nail down is that you do not have to sacrifice coding content for ethics content. They are not mutually exclusive. Ethics content can actually support the coding content that you want to teach really well, honestly. So I started teaching coding assignments by beginning by thinking about what the coding content was that I needed to cover first. And then I brainstormed which ethics content might be a good fit for those technical skills afterwards. So an example of this is if you're teaching something like conditionals, if else lends itself well to discussing like the problems of classification, or it turns out that if you're designing algorithms and functions, that lends itself well to ethical decision-making and trade-off ideation. So there's a lot of different examples where you can map coding skills to ethics-based skills. So I'm going to go through this section pretty quickly in the interest of time, but feel free to follow up if you have any questions about this. This is just some of the pedagogy that I thought was really helpful for my students over the summer, because it wasn't just about changing the content, it was also about changing the structure and the flow of a typical computer science class. So each of the modules that I designed lasted about 1 to 2 weeks. And I really like this approach because the students weren't being asked to just code in a vacuum. They were given an opportunity to just dive deep into a topic and relate it to their personal life, so that when they were asked to do coding, they had a lot of ideas for where to begin. So starting with multimedia, this included things like YouTube videos, current news articles, podcast episodes, and just asking them to consume engaging content so that they can get hooked on the topic without just having to read like an entire textbook, basically. And then going into a reflection, giving them the time and space to reflect on how what they learned applies to their daily lives. So keep continuing to bring it back to them and how this applies to them. And then discussing all of the topics together as a class. That was a really important step. This is an example of with the moral machine trolley problem. I actually asked the students to answer a live anonymous poll for who they would save in the trolley problem, so that later on when they were coding this decision, they had already encountered that ethical dilemma and they kind of knew what their reasoning around it was. So after they've critically learned, reflected, discussed, engaged, then they're ready for the coding assignment. And they are much more attentive and engaged at this point if you go through the steps before the coding assignment instead of just throwing them into it. And then, of course, asking them to reflect in the coding assignment was really, really beneficial. It kind of made the assignments feel more full circle from a teaching perspective, because they were able to reflect on the impacts of their code and the decisions that they chose instead of just coding and releasing their code into the grading software system without thinking at all about what they had done. And then, of course, concluding every module with a small group and larger class discussion helped just kind of conclude the module and help them feel like everything, all the loose ends had been tied up. So I know I'm running out of time here, so I'm just going to kind of briefly mention some things that I noticed really came out of this module-based learning system. Was that the students were participating heavily, very, very engaged, and based off the feedback they gave, they really enjoyed it. So this wasn't just about incorporating ethics for the sake of incorporating ethics, but it was actually about making content that helps computer science students learn better. And two thoughts that I will leave you with here is that coding classes should not exclude class discussions or reflections. They don't need to be only about coding. Coding content does not need to be boring and dry, and ethics is a great way to make coding assignments more engaging, exciting, and relevant for students. Thank you. And I think I'm passing it off to Augustine.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm so sorry we are all in the same room, and we would have a much broader group to address and see each other. But I'm so thrilled to see so many questions and so many people introducing themselves to bring to that. I have probably -5 minutes right now. So I'm going to try to go quickly to some of the slides that I wanted mostly to show an example of how we include ethics and especially different type of evaluation, as you may have question about it. And I'm going to touch a little bit about the motivation. So we all discussed, what you're all familiar with, the current content of how ethics is in SCS training. Quick summary, they all feel distant, removed from business as usual. That doesn't seem to really fit what the expectation of students from what will happen later in their career. And there's a big question, how do you evaluate, how do you know that people taking a class or a break before are actually learning something and would actually be transformed to make better decisions, if that's at all possible? So we want to change that and find other model. You've seen already examples. I'm just going to go over one example, perhaps slightly more in detail for a few minutes, although I'll have to go very, very fast through some slides. So you understand first, our first answer to how to do that is to basically integrate ethical intervention in any class. We've already seen that with Jess in the coding, and I'm just going to provide an example that comes more from a theoretical class, and it's going to answer a couple of the questions that I've noted in the Google Doc. So this is lecture 2 of the network and crowd class. And I'm reminding everybody that, at the last lecture last week, we learned that networks have a lot of characteristics. They did connect, different nodes in ways that span various disciplines. My slide is slow to pass. I think it's because of one of the graph. I'm sorry about that. This is going to come in a minute. And after this lecture, we have basically learned a couple of concepts. We know what is a path in a graph. We know about random graph, and we have learned that it's possible to build a path going from node to node and reach quickly lots of people. Why is this not possible? Okay, it's coming. Network exists among us, and this is a definition of a path. So we are basically at the very beginning of learning about graph and path. So that's where I propose to basically, I'm basically finishing the definition of random graph. And this is where in the class, we make a first intervention to discuss, okay, we've just learned basically 2 definitions. Is there ethics there? Are we going to have to think about ethics when we just apply those definitions in any different context? And usually this would be something that may come a little later in the class or at the end of an advanced class. So we're just immediately doing a first intervention where we discuss, okay, we're going to discuss about privacy. And I'm going to try to motivate you to care a little bit more about privacy. And then we're going to see whether or not what we learn is at all relevant to the issue of privacy today. So the way we do in the class is basically I'm saying, we're going to talk about privacy. I'm going to give you 3 big ideas that are very important that summarize 20 years of research on privacy, if you like. And then we're going to see, does that come back to the thing we just learned in the class? And then, of course, most of that is followed up in homework. So the way I set up the class is to sort of make a devil's advocate discussion where I basically ask students, look, you probably didn't spend a minute before thinking of, privacy for computing. At least if you did, that's great. But, why would you frankly say, I have no time, I don't want to invest time there? And then we say, okay, what are those attitudes that you may have to justify yourself that this is not your job? And we try to criticize them. And I have basically 3 prepared, but most of the time there's more discussion coming from other people who have different reasons why they would basically ignore and not care about that when they apply algorithm. So, for instance, one of them, I'm just going to do one. You say, it's not my job. It's above my pay grade. I'm an engineer. I'm basically here to make things learning. And I know there are lawyers whose job is to be, guiding what should be done by technology and follow the law. And I'm going to let them deal with that. And I'm going to, of course, listen to whatever guidelines is coming from there. And that's basically an attitude that say, I'm protected from that by this organization that happens. And we say, well, that's maybe true, but, there are many lawyers. Lawyers may totally disagree on what is totally appropriate in a situation. And also, there's a decision of whether, as an engineer, are you really sort of just taking the rule made by others, or are you part of the decision that is going to affect what is going to be deployed? So that's one way, for instance, in which we debunk one of the myths about privacy. And there are many others, people don't know what they want, privacy do not exist, it's part of being in business, and that we're going there, and I can go in more detail if you like. Then we go to one definition of privacy that is slightly more, slightly broader than basically just being unmonitored and unseen. And for that, we basically very quickly provide, two references that should be there for them to know in their culture. And then we basically fast track to understand things that are very close to things we learn in class. So, for instance, the K-anonymity papers from Latanya Sweeney, on and with the context and its importance. And then why this is coming, recurrently in different situations where we have network data, and this is where it starts to get a little closer to what we just learned in the previous class, where we discussed sparsity of graphs. And then I describe, how lots of different social network services are going to be affected in the same way. And usually there's a way to apply that, because every year there's a new privacy scandal that is going to come back. That is coming. From that point, we basically start looking at how, in a similar way that we just saw in this famous example on privacy, it's going to be very easy to find a fingerprint of a person in a graph. And the way we do it is just by using node steganography. So just from the fact that there are paths and node connection, we can actually find unique pattern. And this is the way that, famous politicians, for instance, who pretended they had a secret Twitter account were basically revealed publicly. And we sort of see how the information that you learn by graph can already be used by an algorithm doing that. We try to learn, we understand why it's robust. And then we move on to understand, okay, and beyond that, when beyond just re-identification of people, there are some real consequences. And we're looking at the problem of suggesting people you may know on Facebook, the friend suggestion algorithm, that is typically based on common friends and the set of common friends that we have with them, and other sort of, bits that could be showing that you have a particular similarity to people you are not friends with yet. And we discussed, one consequence of that being, this is an algorithm that would typically have been designed following a class. This class that we were learning 10 years ago. In fact, one of the persons that is famously, the author of the algorithm used today at Facebook is an ex-TA of a similar class taught in another university, but that could have been at Columbia. And we describe, how the Gizmodo article showed that the people you may know, once it was deployed, revealed a ton of basically bridge between accounts that should not that should be protected from being associated together. And the most serious example being a sex worker maintaining 2 Facebook accounts that has been connected, and that person had a client in a sex work life being recommended to a private account that was sort of a personal account that she had, of course, separated clearly from it. And so we were explaining how the arm of an algorithm is going, and how there's no today a real trade-off going against this algorithm. This algorithm is running, it's continuing to do harm, and there's basically no change in sight. And after that, we basically learn how the fact that paths are going allows you to basically expand from small identification to re-identify everyone in a graph. And this is where I'm not going to bore you with the technical of the proof, but we take a theoretical problem of matching graph to each other based on situation of having common neighbors, and we explain in a few lines how counting common neighbors could be a very, very strong, powerful way to re-identify everyone in a graph in the same way that information could propagate. So that's an example of what we're doing. There's a follow-up there. And that caused the question, how do we evaluate learner in being responsible? Well, my first answer to that is, first, you can learn how they have been trained for being responsible in computing as a skill. And this is relatively, it's made easier by the fact that you integrate the technical training with the ethics. It's just basically a confirmation of what Jess was showing. You don't have to separate those two things. They could be together when you use technical training to highlight that some ethical problem lead to new measure, new definitions that are important to understand whether your algorithm is correct. Not just correct for a proof of convergence or the number of resources it's doing, but also in preventing a possible harm. And especially when it becomes a technical problem, technically savvy student understands that ethics is also technically challenging and may have a taste for it that is developed. This is typically done by showing examples in class and then having homework. This is another example coming from another homework where we looked at a typical drinking habit survey that reveals some information that are de-anonymized, and how students could, from this survey, basically reproduce the entire graph of who is drinking with whom on campus. So this is one of the other example we're doing. Beyond that, you might say, okay, this is fine, but this is basically just evaluating ethics as a skill. Would they be able, if they wanted to do something ethical, to actually code it and understand the problem and address it? You might also want to evaluate their attitude or their aspiration towards ethics, which is, you know, a slightly different dimension. And there might be, of course, many other dimensions that I'm missing there. So for that, what we did was actually to evaluate it in practice through a sort of mock experiment that was, so this is another class where we are following the same integration of ethics, which is taught by Nakul Verma on machine learning. So it's a broader, much larger class where, you know, most of the machine learning framework is basically taught. Every one of these homework has an ethical question. So what the concepts that are learned during that week are relevant for understanding you know, a particular ethical problem. And through multiple experiments, we basically were able to run actual prediction bias removal with, you know, during one of the homework. So the last homework of the training was one where the students were given, and you know, all details are in the paper. I just really want to go to your question later on. They were given a prediction task that is basically filtering resume and selecting people to go to interview using data that were biased. And we were using different treatment groups to understand how different students react to, for instance, being in a group where the data were not biased, or being in a group where the data were biased, but they received technical guideline, being in a group where they had a reminder that it's important to check before applying that you don't have, you know, bias in your data. And the paper will show what we learned from it, but it was a very interesting way to understand, you know, the evaluation of what contributes to basically more responsible and socially conscious code. And it's not necessarily what you expect. If people have questions, I'll go in more detail. But, you know, for instance, we found that there's no evidence that as an individual programmer, if you are female or if you are from a group that has been marginalized from computing in the past, you are necessarily coding yourself an algorithm that is going to remove more bias. On the other hand, we found that when you combine algorithms that were made by multiple learners, the fact that your team was diverse would actually be a boost in removing bias in the solution. So there seems to be an evidence for the bonus of having diverse team, but you know, this is at the level that we see an improvement. We found that unbiased data was by far the best way to solve the problem. That is motivating us to say, you know, instead of perhaps, you know, having better programmer, you can just have better data to begin with. That's kind of an important message to improve. And we also find that, you know, reminders from having, you know, with the fact that the data could be biased and you should probably run a test to check that, actually worked. They remove most of the bias. So it's better than the control group where we basically give the problem without reminders. But the technical advice when we were providing an actual method to do it was actually counterproductive. People follow the method to the rule without actually truly solving the problem. So there seems to be some lesson learned on how to apply that for future cases. This relates a little bit to some of the questions we have, but I want to make sure we address them at due time. Thank you so much. I hope that was giving you a few advice.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for that. I think that was a really good start to get us thinking about a lot of different things. So I have been super excited by how much engagement there is in this document that we collected, as well as on Slido on the live stream page. And we've also been putting the comments from Slido into the document so that they will still be there when this is over. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, get up, stretch, etc. Or if you like, you can also use that time to add more questions. I've also added a place in the document for where we have some provocations and people want to answer some questions, and also a place in the document for your ideas and expertise and anything that you would like to add to the entire group. And during this short break, we are going to strategize a bit around these questions to answer some things live and talk about some things. But we would also really encourage you to answer each other's questions, either in the Slido or on the document. So we will be back in 5 minutes. If you have any questions for us in the meantime, you can also leave, logistical questions in the Slido. All right, according to my clock, that was 5 minutes. Time flies. Welcome back. It would be so great. It would, like, if we were in a physical room and could be like, did everyone come back from the bathroom, or is the room still empty? I'm just going to assume that a lot of you are here. So we're going to have a sort of panel discussion now based on the questions that were left in the Slido. Jess is going to moderate. Again, I would encourage you to answer each other's questions as well and to leave your thoughts wherever you want in that document about all the things that we are saying, in addition to just us talking, since we happen to be the ones on camera. All right, Jess, I'm going to hand it over to you to moderate.
Thank you, Casey. All right, welcome to our Expert Ethics in the Computer Science Classroom panel. So the way that I'm going to ask these questions is just directly from Slido in the priority of the ones that have the most thumbs up, because that means that they're important to the people here. So the first question that we have is from Gina. And Gina asked, I'm curious if anyone is seeing a turn to including teaching on how to be a whistleblower. If we're teaching ethical reasoning, but we don't equip students with an understanding of what to do when they encounter resistance to ethical decision-making, what good are we really doing? So the floor is open for anyone who wants to take a stab at that.
Casey, I think you had one.
I can give a little bit of a start to that. So, you know, a couple of years ago, I was at this like ethics education workshop, and someone asked the question, which was basically like, okay, let's say we do our job. Let's say that we create like the most ethical computer science graduates ever. Like, then what? When they go, you know, to these companies and, you know, are working in places where maybe not everyone agrees with this, et cetera. I think this is something that we absolutely need to be thinking a lot about. I don't know that I have like the answer to this question, except that I think that part of teaching these things is teaching about organizing and speaking truth to power and these kinds of things that are obviously very big issues right now. And it's certainly something that we have conversations about in my classroom. So I don't have a good answer for you, except that yes, this absolutely needs to be part of it. Solon, were you? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly echo what Casey was saying, and I think like I think this question also gets to what is a potential danger in the way that we sometimes approach this kind of education, which is to think of it as being like, how do we inculcate students to become responsible practitioners when like some of these issues are not about individual responsibility, but about structure and organizing, and sometimes even just law. So I think like whatever we might be doing in these efforts around education needs to actually be complemented by other things. And some of that can be organizing, as Casey has mentioned. And I think that's like been over the past years, like demonstrably very important. But some of it could also be like, you know, prominent figures in certain fields, like standing behind people who actually do these things. So like it's important for more junior people who are kind of observing the field that might enter to see that, you know, when people actually do these things, that the people who are, you know, and validate them. So, you know, I think there's a lot of things that have to happen, not just with the people who are about to enter the field, but all this kind of surrounding structure as well. And I hope that can be part of the conversation.
Yeah, I thank you. I would first say that there's two great answers in the Google Doc that we, you know, unfortunately they cannot speak, but, you know, we would otherwise in the room have them introduce that. Thank you, Deborah and Ted, for those contributions. What I want to share quickly was, I think it's important to prepare students to the fact that ethical training is going to be about them making decisions, and that we, as professor, understand that some decision is under constraint for them. And the typical example I have is people who say, you know, I have a job at a company that I don't like, you know, some of the things they're doing as a consequence, but, you know, I need a job to, you know, pay the rent and support my family. And in that case, you know, a discussion is very important for us to say yes. And we we think there's a room for people inside to bring a principle and all that, and not look, seems to imply to the student that they have to bear the burden of the principles that we discuss in class. It's extremely easy when you're a tenured professor to talk of important principles, and that it's, these are absolutely mandatory to apply. And then, of course, your job is in education and extremely protected compared to people under pressure. The second thing that I want to share is that ethics is often a lot about what not to do. You show a lot of counterexample and examples that are essentially bad things not to do. And you can imagine one of the examples that I included in my slides were like that. It's important to have students sensitized to the positive thing that is ethical. So, and one thing that I'm doing in the class, for instance, is to describe measurement to keep accountable service. So we learn about what is a way in which you could potentially design an experiment to prove that ads are discriminatory, for instance, and what will it take, and then we help them to go directly at your question on whistleblowing. One thing you should know if you're a whistleblower is what is exactly, how are you going to empower, and probably not you, but a journalism or a nonprofit organization to be able to react to the problem. What is the information that is important for them to have in order to document and prove? And I typically use two examples when I talk about that. A good and a bad example. The good example being from ProPublica and the housing discrimination happening on Facebook that has been made with reproducible experiments and transparent data that everyone can have, and a very strong proof that there were discrimination on Facebook. And the relatively bad whistleblowing example is the one from Amazon, where Bloomberg reported that Amazon had a sexist hiring algorithm, but that's just a rumor in one article based on a journalist talking to a person who left the company. Obviously, that cannot have the same impact in terms of pushing things forward, because there's no actual documentation. That person didn't connect to a strong journalism organization and help solve the problem. So if you want to do whistleblowing, you have to be also smart about how do you empower the people who would make a difference. And that's kind of topic that we can discuss, because they are also a little technical to help within the class. I hope that gave a little bit of an answer.
Great, thanks for those responses, everyone. So we're gonna move on to the next question. This one actually has a few comments in Slido and the Google Doc. This is a question from Dylan, and they asked, how can teachers navigate whose ethics to teach in the classroom? For example, in my experience taking ethics classes in a business school, ethics were seen as either utilitarian or deontological, Western-centric, and the reading list was only white scholars. How do we center more diverse perspectives?
I'll jump in a little bit on that one. Thank you, Dylan, for that question. I think it's a really critical point for us to focus on. I mean, as you point out in your question, I think the first step towards thinking about ethical discussions is to recognize that there's a diversity and pluralism in the first place. So just within the Western tradition, as you point out, there's all these different ways you could approach a problem that could be really helpful to get students to understand that there's not a simple answer. There's not a right ethical answer to most of these questions. We also face this, and I've faced this throughout my career, trying to engage in what we called values in design. How do you work with business people or engineers? And you have competing ethical frameworks, the ethics of efficiency versus the ethics of privacy, and just dealing with those complications. And there's tool sets you can use to help people think through what are the implications of a certain ethical framing and how does that sort of impact people downstream. But that is a unique challenge. And I'm glad you brought that up, that we're dealing with sometimes a clash of ethical systems. But the final point I'll address, and I think Casey and others have some feedback too, perhaps, to bring in non-Western traditions, there's been increasingly approachable work by people in information ethics and internet ethics that are embracing Confucian ethical frameworks from Africa and from India as well, and how those can help inform the way that we think about rights within technology. And also, I mentioned it in the Google Doc, and I won't go into depth here, but this question of embracing ethical pluralism which is something that Charles S. writes a lot about, that we can have a pluralistic view of ethics, but not falling into the relativism trap that anyone's ethics are valid. This is sort of that both sidism that we often see in contemporary discourse right now. And so it's a careful thing for us to balance. And we could talk more. I could point people to more resources on that if needed.
I'll just briefly reiterate something that I said as a reply to that question, which was like, if you're going to teach traditional ethical theory, which, I kind of didn't for a while, then I realized various reasons that it was useful, which I'm, could talk more about. But like, if you're going to teach deontology, then you should probably talk about the fact that Kant was racist and what does that mean? Like, and and it's a good jumping off point for having some really important conversations around that kind of thing, because I mean, like, not even just that Kant was racist, but the fact that so many of the ways that we think about ethics is awfully white and awfully male. And so I think that those are important conversations to have. And, a lot of the answer to this as well is like, this often isn't about right answers, right? Like, that's something that can also be challenging for computer science students, is like, oh, you're not going to give me an answer. And this is why things like utilitarianism can be so appealing. But for me, like, my course objectives for an ethics class aren't like recite the categorical imperatives. It's like, learn how to be a critical thinker. And I think that's really important. So I think that, like, teaching ethics, like, the biggest outcome I want is for people to care and be able to think about things, not to come to any particular answer, at least as a start.
If I may, I have two concrete advice. The first one is in the integrated ethics, there's an opportunity to bring researcher or scholars who had technical contribution. So in my class, the first paper we're doing on privacy, after citing Elenis and Bowman, Soshan Zubov's book, is to look at Latanya Sweeney's paper on k-anonymity. And that is just, providing an example of, the main technical contribution and privacy breakthrough that was coming from a scholar of color. And then, you can talk about, the importance she had in that field. And that puts also people who are not white in the position of being technical leaders, not just also the person who sort of reflect on the ethics and the social implication, but also directly in the, in the trenches of the algorithm. So that's one thing I'm doing. Another thing that is sort of, is important is to sort of frankly acknowledge that any effort to bring ethics into a field that is not in parallel with an effort that is making this field more diverse is incomplete. So I my department and my lab organize a summer school for different voice to be part of AI leadership, and that's part of the things we discuss. We discuss that it's important to have, and that they are, we are recruiting TA for the summer, and that this is part of that. And that goes back a little bit to a question, a provocation that I had put into the thing for attendees. What to do with ethics and activism. I think it's very important for a class to address both. Personally, I think it's very important that ethics doesn't become this sort of abstract philosophical. There's a right way, and activism is by definition something that is controversial, subjective, and that doesn't belong to science. I think what's important is to understand that it is science inform activism, and that being part of people who think and people who analyze the system and admit some plurality, but with bounds, is part of the ethics as well. So this is sort of the way that I think we are allowing more voice to be heard as much as I can. I mean, unfortunately, I am myself not bringing diversity at all with my voice, but I can at least sort of represent others. That's how we do it.
Thank you for those great responses, everyone. And just a note for everyone who's watching right now, we might go a few minutes over, just to warn you, but we are reaching the end of our panel. So there is an interesting question that was posed by Debbie that I'm sure some of you have thoughts about. And Debbie asked, what are your suggestions for faculty without expertise in ethics or fairness who are tasked with teaching a tech ethics course? And I'm going to add to that, who maybe are not just tasked with, but would like to and don't really know how to, or think that they're not qualified.
I can start quickly, in part because I was one of the people who responded. So I actually think that there's a growing community of people who are doing these kinds of, who are teaching these kind of classes or developing them. And Casey in particular has done a lot of work to help people get to know each other who are teaching those classes. And I think like, while it's common for people to look at other folks' syllabi, this is like one of those areas where like there's a lot of material you can look at to get inspiration and to kind of see how other people are going about this. And so, I mean, I hope that the community continues to grow and that we continue to engage with each other a lot. But I actually think like people should not be shy about like really learning from other people's experiences. And I think what's so great about the spreadsheet that Casey started is that you get a really broad range of classes. So like when I was talking at the very start of the tutorial about very different approaches to teaching this class, you'll find like variation in the way people approach this. Some of those classes may be much more technical and it would be inappropriate for someone who doesn't have like a technical background to try to replicate. And others, would be like much more philosophical, would be really a challenge for someone who comes from CS to teach. And I think depending on where you sit, like with respect to these different fields, it's pretty clear to me at this point, you'll find some example that is relatively well matched to your set of expertise. And that could just be a really good starting point. And so I really encourage people to learn from each other.
I wanted to add that students demand that any professor doing CS ethics integrating is not claiming that they know ethics, so that we remain humble. That I remember having very, very strong input from students saying, we want ethics to be part of the curriculum at CS, but not necessarily taught by you. So that was pretty clear that they are thinking about that. And so you may ask as an educator, especially if you are a computer scientist, what's my role there? One thing that I've seen works is to start from your expertise. If you like, I can take the example I give in my class. I'm a guy working with graph. I had to find this problem. This problem has ethical background. There's a problem there. I design a homework for it and all that. And here there's a form of authority I have just by the fact that it's a technical problem on graph that helps me sort of being part of there, that sort of represent who I am. And I'm open to the fact that there's this ethical part. Some of I don't understand well. And I'm humble about them, but I can show that there's a translation. And I think as long as students understand people who translate in their expertise and they see that in action, that's empowering for them to believe that they can also do this translation. And it's totally fine if a topic, race being one, for instance, seems overwhelming to teach about or to have involved in a homework. You might be caught off guard by a student who have a very profound question about that. As long as you are here to sort of work on the translation in your class of what is important to understand in the technical side, you are sort of playing a role in bringing more responsibility. So that's one way. I'm sure there are others, but that in addition to educating yourself with the possible materials, of course.
I'll also add that I think that it's actually quite important that computer science professors are doing at least some of the teaching of this kind of stuff, because I've seen models where, anything related to ethics is like outsourced to the philosophy department, which like it's, I would love for students to take philosophy courses as well, but I feel like it reiterates this idea that like, oh, that thing though, that's not computer science. Like I have to learn this thing because they're making me take all these humanities classes or whatever, but it's not part of being a computer scientist. And I actually think that attitude is really damaging. And I mean, I recently gave a talk at a computer science department and they asked me like, what's a thing that we could do? And I said, hire people whose research area is computing ethics into your department and give them tenure, and model that like doing ethics is part of computer science. So that's what I would do if I could wave my magic wand.
Yeah, and I want to connect that to another question we had. Someone asked, should AI education be domain specific or sort of general? I have a relatively, strong opinion about that. I think it's very important to see ethics inside the method. And you might be wondering why. Well, because the same ethical problem show up in different new application of computer science all the time. So once we learn that there's a problem with the way the graph is done for a particular application, if you treat that as okay, but it's a health problem, so we're gonna only people who are gonna apply that to health are gonna learn that in their ethics of health. The problem is that soon computer science is going to enter a new field. I don't know what it is, geoengineering, and there will be the same exact method creating the same side effect. And the computer scientists who bring their method in a new field, if they are not trained, are going to reproduce the mistake that were learned. So it shouldn't be domain specific, at least not entirely domain specific for that reason. There will be a new domain, basically innovation and disruption brought by computer science that have to be ethically informed. Otherwise, you're losing a lot of those ideas. And that goes back to what Casey was doing, is that it should be hosted by computer scientists and partially owned with humility by computer scientists. I think is a good model.
And I think real quickly to follow up, I think really embracing, part of what I think everyone's been saying so far, there's so much happening right now in current events that you can leverage as an instructor. So you don't need to be a trained ethicist. You can talk about what's in the news today. That's actually how I start all my classes. I pull up the technology channel on Google News and we just walk through it. And there's almost always something that is directly related to class. And it allows students to see those connections. It's training them to find those connections between controversies, issues. And it's not just for controversy's sake. There's some kind of interesting ethical problem or design variable, or who knows what was happening in that space. You could teach an entire semester where you're just watching an episode of Black Mirror or Star Trek or whatever it is that makes sense for you as a way to engage with this space. I think there's lots of just really kind of creative ways. And to Solon's first point, leveraging the community. This is the kind of class where you can just really use TED Talks. You can use videos from conferences. I'm also thinking of videos that my colleagues here have made. People like, Arvind Narayanan has made some great, tutorials and videos on issues related to this. And those are just discussion starters. And that's just a great way to kind of enter into these courses.
Great. Well, that concludes our panel since we are running a little bit over already. So thank you for those amazing responses. And Casey, I'm going to pass the mic back to you to finish up.
Yeah, so I am thrilled by the number of people who are here, apparently, based on the number of people in that Google Doc. It will remain there. I would encourage you to keep answering each other's questions. Feel free to leave contact information if you want other people to contact you about this kind of stuff. I was hoping that we could kind of end on like some action items, next steps, etc. I'm always hesitant to suggest like, oh, let's start an email list, or oh, let's start a Slack channel, or something like that. But I would just encourage all of you to continue having these conversations. And if something comes out of this, if we decide we want to continue talking in some formal way, feel free to leave like an email address with your introduction in that document, or you can also just contact me and we'll kind of figure this out as we go along. But mostly I would encourage you to keep talking to everyone about this. And thank you all for coming. If you have additional questions that you would like answered, please leave them in the document. We'll keep an eye on the document for the next couple of days and leave answers for you as best we can, including all those questions that got asked that we didn't get to in the short time that we had. So thank you again. Please feel free to reach out to any of us, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. All right, bye everyone.
Bye.